Hey there, it's Mike Koger with Salt and Summit Construction and Renovation, and today's question is, how much does it cost to finish a basement? Specifically, how much does it cost to finish a basement here in the northern Utah area? So stick with me, and we'll talk about everything you need to know. All right, so first let's define what we're talking about. See, most time when we're finishing basements, you've got an unfinished space that might be, let's say, 1,500 to 1,800 square feet, but maybe you only want to finish 12 to 1,300 of that, depending on what you've got. A lot of people have crawl spaces, storage areas, cold storage, which obviously is not going to get finished. And so we're talking, let's say, 12 to 1,500 square feet of finished basement space or basement space that will be finished. Now, sometimes it goes up to 1,800 square feet finished space, and sometimes well above. I mean, we've done houses that are 2,000, 3,000 and above. But the typical basement finish we're seeing is, let's say, 12 to 1,500 finished space range, square foot range. So typically homeowners are looking for minimum 2 to 3 bedrooms, sometimes 2 to 3 bedrooms and an office. If they have the extra space, you're looking at least 1 to 2 bathrooms. We don't typically do half bathrooms in basements just because typically it's just kind of a waste of space. I mean, unless you don't have the drainage ability, we just kind of go for the 2 bathrooms. But with that, we typically do a living area of some kind, and sometimes that living area is blended in with a kitchenette or a full kitchen sometimes. And so there's a large variety of layouts that you could do in a basement, depending on your specific house size and what's existing in the basement already. So that's what we're talking about. Let's get on to the numbers. Okay, so typically with these basements, 12 to 1,500 square feet, this is what we're seeing. We're seeing framing, insulation, we're seeing drywall, flooring, paint, including the bedrooms, the bathrooms, kitchenette, living area. So this kind of project build that we're seeing on average is going to fall somewhere in between the $150,000 range to $180,000 range. That's for the complete finished basement from start to finish. Now, this is kind of like a mid-range. I'm not going to say builder grade because typically that has a cheaper connotation, but I'm talking about a mid-range, mid-budget, not going all out with, the most expensive finishes and tiles and everything else and cabinetry, but also not going cheap box store, Home Depot, Lowe's cabinets, that kind of stuff. So this is like a good mid-range, and these numbers might seem a little high to you, and granted, they might be even on the higher end, but I would rather give you a slightly higher number and then we come out a bit lower than for me to give you a super low number, then we start talking about your project and all of a sudden we're $50,000 above what you expected. So if you're wanting to finish your basement and it sounds about like that scope, 12 to 1,500 square feet, and everything I listed in terms of the rooms and whatnot, I'd probably bet on about $150,000, $180,000 by the time it's all said and done. Now, if you wanted to do it for slightly less, you could definitely skip the bathroom, skip the kitchenette area or the wet bar area, maybe keep it more open, have less personal private space like bedrooms or offices, and have more of an open living space. We definitely see that. And, if you're dealing especially less with utilities, you might even be in the $90,000 to $150,000 range. So obviously that's a large range, and it just depends on what you choose for your specific project. But you could definitely get down there. And if you wanted to skip the utilities altogether, now, let me back up a little bit. You're probably going to have electrical with your project either way, because you're going to have lights, you're going to have outlets for the bedrooms. But if you're going to skip anything with plumbing, if you're going to skip anything with HVAC, you could probably get it down to, let's say, even 60,000 or maybe a little bit above that, just depending on how big your space is. But on that note, one thing that I tell clients is this: if something is worth doing, it's worth doing right. And then I add this caveat: it's worth doing right the first time. One thing that I hate to see, and unfortunately, I have never seen it on my personal projects, but I have seen it on dozens and dozens and dozens of other people's projects. But you'll have clients that'll come to you and say, hey, we want this done. We're trying to save money. We're going to cut the scope down, cut the budget down. We get it to this lower range that maybe feels a little bit better to us. And then 6 months down the road, a year down the road, 5 years down the road even, hey, could we add a bathroom? Could we add a kitchenette? Could we add laundry fixtures? Well, the fact is, once your project's already completed and you have your drywall and your insulation and everything else up, it's going to be so much harder and so much more money in order to put those fixtures in where you want them to go than if you just did it right the first time. HVAC in particular, you're talking about the entire ceiling needs to be open to run venting. plumbing. It's just going to be so much easier to be able to just run it without the drywall, cut your drains out of the concrete. That kind of stuff needs to be done in the unfinished basement stage. Now, if you want to just cut a budget, but you think you might want to add that later on, what I'm going to tell you is just hold off. Even if it takes a year or two, if your project doesn't need to be done like yesterday, just hold off, because it's going to cost you a lot less money in the long term than if you wanted to try to add all this high-end expensive stuff later on. So now I'll talk about some of the things that really push the cost of these projects up. Now, here's some things that a lot of people miss, a lot of people don't think about. 99 times out of 100, you're most likely going to need HVAC in the basement. The only times we don't see us adding the HVAC is if it's a basement remodel instead of a finish, and they've already got an HVAC system in the basement. But the fact is, most houses aren't designed to be running 2 levels of air conditioning, whether hot or cold, with just one HVAC system. So typically we're going to have to go in, put a furnace, put an AC unit, put a new condenser, run all of our ducting. That stuff is going to, like I said, 99 times out of 100, we're going to have to do that. And that's going to raise the cost of your project $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, depending on the size of your space and what's needed. So if you're not thinking about that, let's say you come in and you say, hey, I have $100,000 for my project. Well, look, you have to take minus, let's just say $20,000 so that you have a little bit of a buffer. Let's subtract $20,000 off the top. You only have $80,000, because that 20 or 10, 15, 20 is going to have to pay for your HVAC. Okay, your HVAC. So that's one thing a lot of people don't think about. Another one is plumbing. Do you have the water supply going to your house to be able to provide extra bathrooms to the basement? Now, most of the time that's not an issue. A lot of times you're able to run the water, especially if you're only anticipating one person living in the basement, or if it's just like a guest area. Most of the time you have the supply. But something I tell people as well is like, look, if you have the money and you have the time and you have, I guess the forethought, if you can, put in a water heater. Because the worst thing ever is when you have all of your family in town for the holidays and you and your family are upstairs taking showers, getting ready for the night, and you've got your other extended family downstairs also doing the same thing, and now nobody has hot water. You're going to wish you put in that $800, $1,000, $1,500 water heater down in the basement. So that's something to think about. With that, obviously, if you have a kitchenette area, if you have bathrooms, you're going to need drainage, you're going to need plumbing. That stuff costs money. With an average size basement, we're looking at, I'd say on an average, $8,000 to $12,000, sometimes even $15,000 for all new plumbing in the basement being run. And then if you need concrete work done, if your drains aren't already in the floor, that's a ton of concrete cutting. Somebody's got to haul that upstairs. They're going to charge labor for that. Putting the drainage into the ground, that's going to cost money. So those are things to think about. Obviously, with electrical, here's another question. If you have an unfinished basement, how are you going to get power? Typically what we do is we run a wire. If you have the space in your upstairs panel, we'll run a wire down, put a sub panel in the basement, and then run your electrical from there. But you've got lighting, you've got your outlets, your switches, you've got your internet cables if you want them done, or if you want them put in your house or your basement. You've got your smoke detectors. There's so many electrical components that go into this. Vanity lighting is something a lot of people don't think about. But anyways, you got so many things that go into this, and this costs money as well. So just with electrical, you're looking at easily another $8,000 to $12,000, if not above, depending on what you're going to put in. And so, look, with just utilities alone, HVAC, plumbing, electrical, you're looking at an additional $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 on top of your project, depending on what needs to be done. So back to that guy who just had $100,000 for his renovation. If he didn't think about plumbing, electrical, and HVAC, now he only has $70,000, $60,000, $50,000, because that other portion has to go to these utilities, because you can't get it done without those. So those are things to think about. It's not as simple as just framing and drywall all the time. A lot of people think it is. And if it was, honestly, these projects would be a lot cheaper, but that's just not the case 9 times out of 10. All right. So what we're seeing a lot in these newer homes, I'm talking about anywhere built from, I'd say probably 2015 to now, 2025, 2026 actually. A lot of times what we're seeing is these houses are built with really nice I-beam type joists, and they've got their plumbing, they've got their electrical, their HVAC ran through those joists, and so you could just butt the drywall all the way up to the ceiling, right? And if you have a 9-foot unfinished ceiling, you got a 9-foot finished basement. But a lot of the times, especially if you're adding HVAC, you're going to have to run a supply trunk all the way from one side of the house to the other most of the time. And that trunk is going to feed every room branching off of that trunk. Well, where that trunk runs is typically going to be a drop ceiling. So if you have a 9-foot unfinished basement, that area with the trunk is going to be an 8-foot finished basement. And typically, we like to run these through closets or hallways if we can, just so that the main areas aren't dropped. But that's something to think about. You know, you're going to have some drop ceiling in there. If it's an older home and you've got conduit and you've got plumbing or possibly even more HVAC, you know, ran along the ceiling underneath the joist, we're going to need to build a drop ceiling. So you're going to lose some space that way. And to be perfectly honest with you, that costs money. You know, that's a lot more framing and it's above head, so it's a lot harder to do overall. So those are some things to think about. Other things to think about with framing is, are you going to need any structural beams? Now, most of the time with just a basement finish, you're not going to. Sometimes with a basement remodel, and we've done this over and over again, you do, especially if you're going to remove walls and whatnot. Especially with older homes, the basements were built in such a way so that there are a lot of load-bearing walls in the center of the basement. If we're going to be moving walls, even just cutting a foot off this corner or moving this wall back a little bit, we're going to have to add structural load-bearing pieces there. And that's going to cost money. So, you know, going back to the drop ceilings, if you start with a 9-foot basement, but we need a beam there, or, you know, older homes, it's typically an 8-foot basement and you need a beam there, you might only have a 7-foot opening underneath that beam. And so, again, those are things to think about. All right, so moving on. Another thing that I always add, or I always at least try to talk to customers about, is insulation. Most of the time, I've got customers that say, hey, I don't want to be hearing, if I'm down in the basement, I don't want to be hearing people walking back and forth. And if I'm upstairs, I don't want them hearing what I'm doing. I get this a lot, especially with parents, and I'll be perfectly honest with you. I get parents that say, hey, my kid's bedroom is going to be underneath mine. I want to block this sound. That's perfectly, you know, I get it. So one thing that I like to do with basement finishes is I like to think about insulating the joists above your head. What's going to be your ceiling, I'd like that to be insulated. Nobody wants to hear you in the basement, and you don't want to hear anybody above you, and vice versa. So insulation in the ceiling. Another thing I like to add, routine, this is standard across the board, is I insulate the entire perimeter of the house. Typically what we're seeing is you've got an 8-foot or 9-foot, you know, poured concrete wall that makes up your foundation. And we like to frame against that with 2x4s, and then we insulate each of the joists or the stud bays between that, so that you have some thermal break between the concrete and the ground on the outside of that and the inside of your finished space. So that really helps with keeping the climate inside your basement. Another thing that a lot of people don't think about, but I like to include, or at least convince my clients of, is that if you have any type of space that you're going to want privacy in, whether that's a bathroom, whether that's a bedroom, whether that's an office, I like to typically, just overall, I like to put insulation around those walls, because those are interior walls. A lot of people don't think about it because you don't need it necessarily. But look, if you're in the bathroom, you don't want people hearing you. People on the outside don't want to hear you in the bathroom. And same thing with your bedroom. You know, that's a private space. You don't want people hearing what you're doing in there. You might be completely innocent. Hey, I get it. But look, those people don't want to hear you. You don't want to hear them. And it goes same thing with your office. If you're going to be in there working all day or whatever, you don't want to be distracted by outside sound. So anyways, bare minimum, I'd say let's get those walls insulated. It's going to be better in the long run. But with that, ceiling, exterior walls, interior walls, you're looking at easily $5,000 to $7,000 to $8,000 in insulation costs. And ultimately, like I said, it's going to be worth it in the long run. You're never going to regret more insulation. You're always going to regret less insulation. So when it comes down to it, every project is different. You might have two houses that have the identical square footage of their basement, and they're going to need completely different. They're going to have completely different wants, needs, non-negotiables. It's all dependent on you as the homeowner as to what you want to see in your space. And so what I'm going to say is, whether you're going to include bathrooms, bedrooms, more closets, less closets, storage rooms, mechanical rooms, kitchens, etc. I don't know if I said bathrooms, very important in a basement. So this kind of stuff is going to change your price. And so what I would say, typically what we do is, if you give us a call, I'll have my YouTube linked and my social media is linked to my website. Go ahead and give me a call. I'll talk you through your project. I'll give you a rough ballpark number, or you could even use the numbers I've talked about in this video. And If we talk on the phone and it seems like we're a good fit, I'll come out, we'll take some measurements, send it off to the subcontractors, get a perfect number for you, and see if we're all good to go and on the same page. I appreciate you sticking with me, and I hope I gave you some good information. I hope I gave you something that you need. And if not, shoot me a message and I'll see what we can get going. So anyways, thanks for watching. Appreciate it.